Here on Flow FM, we're speaking with Robert Sims, the MLC for the SA Greens. Great to have you on the network.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
Now, not for the first time, but several times the Greens have managed to keep some rent relief and eviction relief for tenants.
That's right. What we've been focusing on is trying to provide a lifeline for those that are struggling during this pandemic. Back when I started in the Parliament in May, we considered the COVID emergency response bill at that time, and the provisions that related to a moratorium on rent hikes and rent increases and evictions were due to expire in May. And I pushed at that time to try and extend them for another 12 months. Well, the government knocked that back, but they agreed to a September extension. We then found ourselves in a situation last week where on the 1st of September those provisions expired. And so when the bill came back to us yesterday, I moved to amend it again, and we got those provisions put back in. So that's going to be welcome news for renters who are experiencing financial hardship.
So there's not just on the front of eviction, but also rent increases won't go up either.
That's right. So if someone's experiencing financial hardship as a result of COVID-19, then they're not going to see their rent increased, and also, importantly, they're not going to be evicted. And one of the things that I've been really concerned about is we know that this pandemic, a once-in-a-century event, has also coincided with a rental affordability crisis here in South Australia. And, you know, if you're somebody who is single and trying to live on JobSeeker, there's not even one single property that you can afford to rent in South Australia. So if you were to find yourself being evicted, your chances of finding another property are pretty slim. And we know that if you're evicted and you don't have another place to go, that can be the path into homelessness for people, and that's something, of course, we really don't want to see. So this will be welcome relief for lots of people that are doing it tough at the moment.
Now, the bill itself didn't have smooth sailing through the Parliament, but this amendment, you managed to get mostly supported to get it up. Was there anyone who opposed it?
Well, it was opposed by the Liberals and John Darley, the independent member of the Upper House in the Legislative Council. But when it went through to the House of Assembly last night, it went through on the voices. So the government didn't insist on making further changes to the bill. And that's a big relief. I think they recognise that the numbers weren't there for what they were wanting to do. And, you know, great that they've actually listened to the Legislative Council and listened to common sense. Because, I mean, I'm sure your listeners would understand that this is a really important issue in the regions as well. I mean, I've had reports of people in Port Lincoln, for instance, that are experiencing financial distress. There's nowhere for them to live in terms of short-term or crisis accommodation. And so some of the support agencies are putting out a call for tents, and people are sleeping on the street in tents. I mean, this is not where we should be at in South Australia, and I think we've got to do everything we can to support people who are struggling during this pandemic.
Absolutely. On this bill more broadly, there were also a couple of other things that came through the lower house from Troy Bell MP. One was about regional representation, and I understand the Greens got involved in the debate about that.
Yeah, that's right. So my colleague Tammy Franks moved some amendments to the bill in the Upper House yesterday. One was to ensure that there's regional representation on the COVID committee, and I think that's very important when you look at, you know, the issues around how the border closures are impacting on regional South Australians in particular. And you've got lots of regional communities that you know, operate on the border between different states. So it makes sense to me and certainly to the Greens to ensure that you've got someone who's got that expertise and knowledge of regional communities at the decision-making table. And the other was to ensure that the minutes are published, made publicly available within 10 days of the meetings. I think that's an appropriate accountability measure, and those things were supported as well. So I think it's certainly an example of the Greens getting some good outcomes in terms of improving legislation.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say about the minutes. There's been this whole controversy about National Cabinet and the secrecy surrounding that. Rex Patrick managed to, I guess, get something open there. So maybe we're starting to see more transparency in the decision-making thanks to our parliamentarians.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the things that's characterised the response to COVID here in South Australia is that there's been a significant level of compliance, with the community. You look at what we're all doing in terms of people checking in and wearing masks and so on. But with that also comes a level of responsibility on decision makers to make sure that they're accountable and as transparent as possible. And I don't think it's too much to ask to say, well, let's make the minutes available, and certainly not much to ask when you consider the experiences of people living in the regions to say, well, let's make sure that they've got a voice at the decision-making table either. So, some good outcomes achieved there.
Robert Sims, MLC from the SA Greens, thanks for giving us some time on the Flow Network.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you.